Good afternoon, everybody. And today we are going to have a conversation about sociology and the role of sociology in a business school and in business education in general. My name is Andrei Щербенок. I'm the director of undergraduate programs here at Moscow School of Management, СКОЛКОВо. I'm also the director of the School of Advanced Studies at the University of Tyumen. And I have today with me Kit Guzik, who is a professor of sociology and the chair of sociology department at the University of Colorado, Denver. Keith received his BA in history from the University of Massachusetts, and he received his MA in Latin American studies from the University of Connecticut, and then he received his PhD in sociology, finally, from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Now, Keith, let me ask you a first question. Why do you think your course, which you are teaching to our undergraduate students right now, which is Fundamentals of Sociology, why do you think it is important for a business BA program?
Great. Thanks for the question, and thank you for having me here. I guess one way in which we could answer that first is by reading through my profile, my biography. You can tell that I'm never satisfied just staying in one place. So moving from a historian to a Latin Americanist to a sociologist, of course, I need to do something new. And one way of doing that is to maybe start a dialogue with a different field than what I'm accustomed to, which is business studies. Now, more seriously, we can also say that business, in terms of what the problematics that it looks to work with, is very much has a sociological imagination. It looks at the world sociologically. So it will use methods that are taken from sociology in terms of doing market analysis to understand user experiences. And it's also using sociological concepts in order to understand how to operate organizations better. And so both internally and externally, organizations are using concepts from sociology in order to do their business. I think it's interesting then to think about what businesses and business school education has taken from sociology, maybe what it hasn't, and to create a dialogue to maybe deepen the exchange and interchange of ideas between the two fields.
Yeah, but let's start not with education per se, but with sociology as a discipline and business as a phenomenon. Do business actually hire sociologists some at certain point to do something, or is it just important for business education, but once you're doing business, you can forget about sociologists as kind of professionals?
Well, one thing that happens is that business school education takes a lot of ideas from sociologists, and then if it takes those ideas from sociology, borrows them, refines them for their own uses, then it does not necessarily need to hire sociologists because they're doing sociology themselves. And I think what's interesting to think about, and I can give some examples from personal experiences about the first, but to think about why maybe just having business scholars or business people read about sociology and then doing sociology is not necessarily enough. To give you one example, and I think you wanted to hear about my interactions with business school faculty, I think that would be appropriate here, that I, in my past, have done a few collaborations with business school faculty, so thinking about the applications of sociology to the broader business world. And the first time that I did this, it was a project that wasn't on business applications at all, but it was thinking about the use of a new technology, which was wearable camera technology by police officers, and police organizations in the United States. The business school at the University of Colorado, Denver had a couple scholars who were doing research into the impact of body cameras on police organizations in the United States. And they already had a pretty good theoretical model built out based on some sociological ideas about the way in which organizations might be affected by technology, the way technology might be affected by the way organizations use them. And they contacted me because they already had some ideas about how to do a survey on the experiences of police organizations with the technology. But what they weren't sure of is the types of questions that they should be including in the survey. What researchers at that time were interested in was whether using body-worn cameras was going to reduce the level of force that police officers use in interactions with citizens. what we found was departments were using the technology in different ways. And it wasn't only to monitor police-citizen interactions. One of the biggest success stories for departments in the state was in using the technology, what they found is that they could eliminate backloads or all the information overload that they had from bringing in police reports, collecting evidence. These were types of data which were collected and stored on different data systems, and they found that when they purchased the body cameras for their police departments, they weren't only purchasing the hardware, which is the cameras themselves, but they were also purchasing software, which was the information management systems to store the videos, share videos. And when they bought that service, it had the unexpected impact of allowing them to store other types of evidence, other sorts of organizational information on the same system. So we found out by doing these interviews with departments that what the police found valuable about the camera technology wasn't at all about cameras. It wasn't all about visibility, but it was about information processing. So by bringing in a sociological method, which was the qualitative research interviews, using inductive approaches of trying to make meaning from someone's experiences, and from doing that, we're able to scale up and get funding from the National Science Foundation to launch a nationwide study on the impact of body-worn cameras on police departments, so scale our research up to reach a bigger audience with it.
So am I right to understand that what sociologists like me, you as a sociologist, contributed is a kind of a wider look at the issue? Not simply, well, let's look at the connection between cameras and violence, but let's look at various meanings or various ways people or police departments use this technology. So you kind of, you introduce larger social context than a business school would normally do when they're interested in a particular issue. Is that correct?
Exactly. And so within an organization, to look at the different departments that might be impacted by a technology, because originally, and still to this day, we look at this technology as only affecting one member of the organization, which would be a police officer. But in this case, it was different departments, evidence management systems, which were going to be impacted by the technology. Not only that, but as you said, outside the organization as well, what are the different impacts that might accumulate as a result of this technology? So sociologists should give us a broader view of the impact of an innovation, of a technology, of an experience beyond what a business or a certain organization might initially have in mind.
You said that actually businesses appropriated a lot of sociological methods in marketing and in other ways that businesses normally do. Do they do it well? I mean, do they do good sociology when they use sociology without calling it sociology, but calling it marketing, for example?
Well, I'm going to be diplomatic and say that they do it well, but they could do it better. And so they've done it well in terms of understanding the basic principles of understanding perceptions, experiences. And again, that's often done with a more narrow perspective of how is this going to impact how our product performs in a particular market? What are the markets that are available to our organization or to our business? And we can use survey research. We can use focus groups. We can use in-depth interviews with folks in order to understand their experiences with a product, with a service, with an experience that we're looking to sell them. The issue becomes, and so business schools, I think, are doing a very good job with that. They've appropriated sociology well there, but I also think there's room for improvement in the way in which that communication goes between business schools, business education, and sociology. And one thing that tends to get overlooked in business environments is the way in which sociology from its start, from the foundations, emphasizes the ways in which what people do and what organizations do is often different from what they think they are doing. And so we often have reasons that we tell ourselves we're doing something. We have reasons for adopting a said technology or undertaking a new innovation, but sometimes those don't match what our actual actions are. What we think do not match our actions. And then the consequences of those actions don't match up with that as well. And to give an example, we were talking in class last week in our Fundamentals of Sociology course about research that was done in sociology about the why, what are the reasons why organizations undertake innovation. The foundations of sociology tell us that organizations will structure themselves a certain way. This is Max Weber's ideas about the birth of bureaucracy in order to pursue technical efficiency, rationality, to always rationalize their operations to have the greatest profit or efficacy out of them. What researchers have found over the course of the 1980s and the 1990s in the United States is that maybe at one time organizations were doing that, but now organizations will tend to adopt what other organizations do, not because it's the most rational course of action, not because it's the most effective in terms of the bottom line, but because it's understood to be the way in which things should be done. And that's what we call isomorphism, that you do something because it's the norm for organizations in your field to do it. That's a potentially powerful idea because when we make decisions in a business environment, we're just assuming we're doing it because it's going to rationalize or contribute to the bottom line. Now, if we take in more of these ideas from sociology about the way in which our actions have unintended consequences and those might inform our further actions, we learn that, well, if we're doing things just because everyone else is doing them, that might not best serve our interests as an organization. So businesses and business education has taken in some of what sociology have done that well, but there's certainly room to bring in more, and being more critical about our own actions could actually be interesting and effective for organizations as well.
Can you speak a little bit why sociology is necessary in order to kind of get a picture of the society? I will tell you my hypothesis, maybe you'll say I am wrong. But my hypothesis is that intuition that all of us have about the society we live in can be more or less correct depending on the situation the society is in. So if the society is stable, we pretty much understand what people like more, what people like less, right? Because we are part of the society, we have this intuition. And if everything is more or less stable, it's been the same for, I don't know, decades, then we can trust our intuition. And then we can, think about introducing new products, for example, or thinking about trends, we can actually imagine ourselves in the place of the customers and kind of just predict what they do. But if society is changing, if it's in a rapid shift, our intuition stops working. And my idea when I actually suggested that you should teach this course is that sociology can be used in the time of rapid development to use theory to predict what's going to happen with the society, which we cannot actually just intuitively feel because our intuition is based on our past experience, not on the future.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I would say there's both pieces. So if we think theoretically, sociology is good at explaining, certainly over the last 30 years, that instability, fluidity is part and parcel, a defining quality of the society that we're living in. That what people were doing 30 years ago isn't going to be what they're doing today. In today's class, when we're talking about trends, that the ways in which people move around a city are not the same as they were even 5 years ago. So we're constantly evolving as a society in what we believe and how we act, the performances that we partake. And sociologists alert us theoretically to the ways in which that's happening in terms of fluidity of structures and networks. Now, I also think that the business world is very good on picking up signals. And so this sort of talk about the fluidity of society is not a revolutionary idea, of course, to the business world. What I would say is that sociology can actually contribute some of that opposite end, which is we tend to believe a little bit too much in today's world that things are so fluid that anything's possible. that the structures that used to define life have been torn down, and so all we need to do is kind of collect or gather in English we use the term herding cats. So herding cats is very difficult to do, but if we can do that, if we understand the fluidity, then maybe we have a better way of restructuring society. Okay, maybe. But at the same time that there's fluidity and the old structures have gone away, they haven't gone away completely. And there's also tends to be new group effects, network effects that are taking place in society. And so anything isn't possible because we have patterns in terms of the ways we think and in terms of the ways we interact, which sort of act in terms of not restructuring society in a rigid way, but forming patterns, networks, and sociologists can alert us to some of those ways. Conceptually, sociological theory helps us sensitize to this new world, but I also think sociological methods in terms of how we listen, how we look at the world is important, because a lot of times, I think in business applications, we think if we just take a focus group, we pick up on some keywords, then we can find a new sweet zone to target a new innovation or a new service. But we also have to understand what are the potential mistakes we're making in terms of sampling bias, what are the potential mistakes we're making in terms of interpretive bias towards we are only going to hear the things we want to hear. So sociological methods have as key a role to play in better understanding this shifting society as our theory does.
You mentioned that you do mostly qualitative sociology, and we live in the era of big data, right? Of many people believe in that you don't need not only sociology, you don't need any kind of conceptual apparatus because you have the data. You have the data, and based on this data, artificial intelligence can predict consumer behavior, can predict everything, and you don't really need to understand why person X does Z. What you need to know is to just analyze tons of data and predict that, and that's fine. And then you can actually base your business decisions on these predictions. What is your take on the role of sociology and social sciences in general in the era of big data?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I have 3 different answers to it, which might be contradictory. One is that when I see big data being used and talked about, there's some new things there in terms of how computer technology is able to aggregate information and to aggregate analyses of it. And so this is a level of calculation that we couldn't do before. So there's something new to it. But it's also not something totally new under the sun in terms of sociologists for a long time have been gathering data about people's lived experiences, looking to discern trends in that, and from that either do business innovations, look at public policy solutions, look at things that aren't working with policy in order to better hone what we're doing in the world. So big data in that sense is not necessarily something new, and sociologists have done it before. What's new perhaps is that the tools themselves are developed by maybe computer scientists, and so that gives them the idea that they're doing something new in terms of analyzing the world through data. At the same time, so that's one aspect in which sociology has always done sort of big data. The other idea is that big data, data science, it also, the way in which we see programs that are popping up now in higher education, you might see aggregations such as computer science departments and math departments taking ownership of this new emerging discipline, and sometimes sociology might not be at the table. But the data which we're analyzing, which is about people's experiences, is about their social lives. And so in that sense, it's inherently sociological. And one could say that, well, yes, it's social, but the data is just giving us a new way to understand people's social lives outside of the sociologists themselves. That's fine. But again, the data tends to be sociological, which means that the types of categories that we're using in order to collect data in the first place about the world is sociological. Maybe in some instances, this might be fairly innocent. But if you start taking applications where you're looking at crime data, and you're going to look at big data models based on criminal offending, and then we can think about that extended out to other sorts of applications. What we think is meaningful about people's actions is sociologically defined. What we define as a gang member tends to be sociological in nature or socially defined. And so common cases, what do we define as juvenile delinquency? This would be cases in which you have minors who are engaging in criminal activity. Well, certainly when I was a boy growing up, I had a group of friends.
And you engaged in delinquent activities?
We engaged in things that were juvenile delinquency, but we didn't go onto the radar of the criminal justice system. So then we could just call it a little set of, it was just me and my friends, right? We were just some boys playing. Now, if you take a different group, they do the same activities, but the police see them and then they take them into the system. Now, all of a sudden, it's just not a bunch of innocent boys being boys, but now you have a criminal organization or a criminal gang or a youth gang. What's the difference between those definitionally? It might not be anything objectively different about it, but they register differently for the criminal justice system, for the police and other institutions in society. And we know that if youth gets defined as a juvenile delinquent, gets defined as a young criminal, then there's a whole other set of social interactions which are going to happen. Other parents, for other children's parents, aren't going to want their children to be playing with that boy or those children. And then we have a whole other set of processes which kick in. What does this have to do with anything with big data? These sorts of categories and classifications that are so difficult to make in person, we know are subjectively biased, get cooked into the big data that we're using. We don't see the bias of those decisions. We don't see the subjectivity of those decisions on the tail end of the big data because it's just numbers. And when it pops out as just numbers, we can say, well, the data is objective. The computer gave it to me. But the inputs into the data initially are socially defined. And then we have outcomes. There's an infamous one, so I'm going to use that one, where the city of Los Angeles had a register of gang members that it was being given from a big data firm, or worked in conjunction with putting this data set together. And on that data set, on their list of gang members were babies who simply were named a certain way, and whatever algorithm that they had adopted was predicting that that person was going to be a gang member because they were not named Bob Jones, but some other name which was commonly associated with whatever the creators of the software thought would be gang members. So we can have very dystopian outcomes if we don't understand the sociological basis of what we think is objective data.
Yeah, and I think my final question is going to be about dystopian/utopian society. If you look at, especially the United States, for example, or West in general, you see lots of movements that try to make society better, and sociologists obviously play a role there, right? So you have a lot of educational programs to, for example, fight racism, fight for gender equality, deal with all kinds of biases, in order to make society, to make society more harmonious, right? In order to reduce crime rate and make it a better place to live. But this is not what we are observing, apparently, right? It's not happening. It's not that the United States now is much more harmonious than it was 20 years ago. So what is your kind of explanation of that? Why is it that all this concerted effort by many, many people, different professionals, in one direction doesn't result in society moving in that direction?
Yes, and what I will give is the answer which always disappoints people when I, as a sociologist, talk. And one answer is, it depends. And so the world is a complex place. Our actions are relational. And so when we set upon one course of action, there's also a set of relationships which are also at work, which are going to also be in play. And so if we think about the case in which we might want to make a college campus more, and this is something that's very much in debate in the United States right now. We might want to make college campuses more harmonious by perhaps limiting the amount of controversial speakers who are on a campus. And so if someone's going to be invited to campus to give a talk who some folks on campus might be opposed to, we might want to avoid that conflict and disinvite the person from talking. So we're going to have greater harmony by doing that. Of course, what happens when we do that is that the people who did not object to it now feel alienated from the process and from the community. And then others who supported that person might feel that that community no longer belongs to them. So the people who did not want the person to speak might feel vindicated, but now you've driven a bit of a wedge through your community and sort of alienated some members of that community and also the role of that organization within society more generally. And so the idea is that there's a complexity to the social world. There's an interconnection between people, between groups, and that when we take a course of action, even like the businesses that we were talking about at the beginning of the interview, you do a certain innovation for a very particular end or for a very particular purpose. It's going to have a set of other consequences as well. And we need to be aware of the fact that a certain course of action won't just have the intended effect. Maybe it won't have the intended effect, but there's going to be other functions, other unintended effects of that as well, and that we always have to be cognizant of that in order to have a better understanding of the results of our actions, but also to do a better job of predicting and thinking about what are the best courses of action going forward.
Yeah, I mean, I promised was going to
Yeah,
be my last
follow-ups are
question,
good.
but since you mentioned campuses, do you think that campus should be a safe space where people are never offended, where everybody feels secure? Because, I mean, there is this trend, obviously, right, in American institutions. I think in the United States probably the most pronounced in this movement. But critics say that, well, the byproduct of that is that you graduate students who go to the real world unprepared, because the real world is not a safe zone. And then if you didn't have an experience in the education that would teach them how to, for example, tolerate a person who is offensive to you, but you have to live with this person, then you will not be able to do that in your real life. My question is, to what extent universities should be this special zone in terms of the cultures and in terms of what's allowed, what's not allowed compared to the society at large?
And I told you when I answer questions, I disappoint. So I'll give you a disappointing answer, which is that it depends. In one sense, university, of course, should be training students for life outside the university. Part of the reason for having a university is to train students to be not only workers, right, but to be productive citizens in society. And so there should be some overlap or continuity between how the real world is, what the university is doing, so that those sort of goals are aligned. On the other hand, universities should be sort of a special place because the real world is one in which we don't always have time to reflect on the forces that are at work in the world. And so the university is a place where we should be able to slow down. We should be able to think ideas through, problems through, and their different manifestations, because the real world often doesn't give us that opportunity to do that. And so in that sense, university should be a special place. Let me also say, to the kind of the sort of not polemical but controversial nature of the question, which is that when we make decisions, there are different values which are at stake. And we can make a set of decisions about we are going to invite people like us to a certain setting. And by doing that, we can make the world more harmonious. And by doing that, we're emphasizing a certain set of values about togetherness, like-mindedness, affirmation of the values that we think define our community. But then we also might be losing off on some or missing out on some other values, which is the importance of free expression in a university community. And increasingly now, when we're thinking about disinviting speakers to American university, institutions are saying that we're losing a little bit of the liberty of expression, which we think is part and parcel of university education. So that value is being lost. And we're finding pushback now in institutions saying that, yes, we understand that a certain speaker or a certain set of ideas might be controversial, but it is important for us, one, to express ourselves, and precisely for the reason that you're saying, to be able to interact with others who are not like us, to build tolerance, to also build our ability to speak across ideological and different sorts of divides in order that we build sort of our resiliency as a society to deal with difference and those who are not like us.
Thank you very much, Keith. Thank you, everybody, for listening. Have a nice day.
Thank you.